Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Personality Theory. And in this particular lesson, I'm going to give you a flavor of personality assessment. So, how do we study personality? How is it assessed? Now, we will touch upon various instruments, but we'll also talk about some research principles as well. So, let's begin. So, in general, when we talk about personality assessment, there are two major subtypes. There's objective assessment, and then there's subjective assessment. Now, the word objective assessment it implies exactly what it says, which is that the instrument being used does not rely on the judgment of the administrator. Most objective assessment instruments are manualized. They have clear scoring guidelines. They are not ambiguous in nature. They tend to be norm referenced and so forth. So my personal view of what I'm seeing does not impact the interpretation of the results very much. Whereas in a subjective personality assessment, there is more of a reliance on the interpretation of the administrator. And that is by design, right? The items tend to be more ambiguous in nature. So it leaves you with the opportunity to interpret any way you want. Now, there are criticisms with subjective assessment. First is, how do we know that if another test administrator were to give this instrument, they would get the same or very similar results? And moreover, let's say that we did get consistency across evaluators. It's possible that they might still be wrong. So that is those are the two criticisms of subjective assessment. Did we interpret it right? And are we having personal biases that are affecting? There are advantages too. So, as with all designs, I think it's important for us to understand that there are strengths and weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages. One of the nice things about subjective assessment, which we refer to as projective instruments, is that they tend to be more free form, which allows you to get a level of depth of personality assessment that you might not get with other instruments. It also is harder to fake the test. And, obviously many of the objective instruments have validity scales in them to test for that. But when you have a subjective assessment or a projective assessment where it's ambiguous in nature, you can't figure out, well, what is the right answer? What's the wrong answer? And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. But when we talk about consistency across evaluators, across administrations, we're talking about a principle called reliability. So reliability looks at the relative consistency of scores or ratings relative to that which is expected. The more consistent the rating or scores are, the more reliable the measure is. Now, truth be told, every instrument, every assessment is going to have some error. No instrument is perfect. You're going to have some error variance. We know that. But the goal is to have as little error variance as possible. We do not want to draw meaningful conclusions but be based on error or noise in the data. So we strive to make sure that our results are largely due to true responses or true performance and minimally impacted by noise or error. So when we talk about reliability, reliability is measured in many different ways. And because we're talking about tests and measurement, we have to talk about the different subtypes of reliability. So the first subtype of reliability is something called internal consistency reliability. When we look at various aspects of the test within itself and compare it to other aspects of the test, do we get a strong correlation? Do we get similarity across? And the most common way to assess internal consistency is something called split half reliability, which is you take a test and you convert it into two smaller versions of the test. And the most common ways to do this are odds versus evens. That's the most common way. And then we just correlate your score on the odd items relative to your even items. And we expect there to be relative consistency or a strong correlation. That's split half reliability. Now, when we do our initial development of an instrument, we also do something called Cronbach's alpha. And Cronbach's alpha is a more sophisticated measure that looks at each individual item and correlates it with every other item. And the overall alpha should be 0.7, 0.8 if we want to say that we have a reliable instrument as a whole. But what's cool about when you run the Cronbach's alpha, you'll get the overall score, but you could also look at each individual item and you could see if it loads onto a specific factor through factor analysis. You could also see what would happen to the Cronbach's alpha of the instrument if an item were removed from the test. And when we start with an instrument, we assume that some items are going to be pulled, not because the test is bad, but if the factor loading is really small and it is weak relative to the other items, then it might not be measuring what the test is supposed to be measuring. So we typically would pull that item or pull whatever items we need to. And that's actually why we do exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis. But I won't bore you with that statistical process because this is personality measures, right? This isn't meant to be a research class or a test and measurements class. We also, so we talked about internal consistency, which measures the relative consistency within an item or a test at one point in time. We might also look for something called test-retest reliability. And test-retest reliability, we would give the same test to the same people at 2 or more points in time. And we would expect there to be relative consistency from point A to point B. Now, there are 2 ways to do test-retest reliability. You could do it in a standard sense where you give the exact same test, or you could give alternate versions, alternate forms of the test, and then you correlate those. There are advantages and disadvantages of both, but the biggest advantage of alternate forms is that it eliminates the possibility of remembering your answers and getting some form of artificial consistency. Now, we do look for patterns. We look for patterns and various aspects of personality that might influence a given behavior. So, giving the test from point A to point B, maybe point C or D, if we continue on a larger longitudinal study, we can identify specific responses and how they remain the same or how they might change over time, right? So we certainly expect in a short period of time for there to be consistency. But with natural maturation, as time passes, we can also expect there to be variability, or we expect changes in your responses through time. And then we also have to pay attention to life events or historical factors that happen between point A and point B, such as traumatic experiences that might alter personality as a whole. So it's tricky, right? So test, retest reliability, we're looking for consistency across time, knowing that the consistency is going to be greater in a short time over a long time period of time, and knowing that trauma could affect it. So there's a debate as to whether test, retest reliability is better than using some form of internal consistency, but nevertheless, both are used. So we talked about reliability as consistency of scores. Now I think it's important to also talk about validity, which refers to accuracy of scores, precision. Validity, does the instrument measure what it claims it's supposed to measure? And there are different forms of validity. We have things like construct validity, convergent validity, discriminant validity, sometimes referred to as divergent validity, face validity. There's a lot of different ones, but validity looks for truthfulness or accuracy of a measure. And here are some common ways to measure validity. Construct validity. So this is where you determine whether the instrument is measuring the theoretical construct it claims it is. So if I wanted to create a happiness measure, I would need to determine whether the items are somehow related to happiness, right? And I would look at the actual content within the measure to determine whether those are associated with happiness. We typically use what's called a panel of experts, where multiple people will rate the test as to what they think it's measuring without being told what it's measuring. And then they are meant to also evaluate the relative comprehensiveness of the measure. Does it have all the items it's supposed to? If there are some missing, what would the evaluator suggest you add? And then sensitivity, which is your range of responses, that's evaluated. But ultimately, that is construct validity. Now, there are other ways to test validity, such as convergent validity. And this is used in the development of instruments anyway. Things like convergent validity. I would give my measure of happiness and perhaps compare it against Emmons, which is one of the major players in happiness, and see if my instrument gets similar scores to Emmons scale. If my measure of happiness is related to another measure of happiness, then we could say that we have convergent validity. The flip side is we also use divergent or discriminant validity to determine whether the instrument can separate things of different constructs. So if I'm measuring happiness and another instrument is measuring athleticism, right? These two factors are not necessarily related. So I would expect there not to be a strong correlation between my happiness measure and athleticism, right? Because they're different theoretical constructs. We also have criterion-oriented validity, which is wanting to be able to predict a given outcome. That would be criterion-oriented validity. Content validity, I described that as a measure of construct validity. So you're looking at the actual items. And then we use what's called multi-trait, multi-method, which is a fancy way of saying that we don't use any singular instrument and draw any meaningful conclusions. If we want to draw meaningful conclusions about personality, we typically recommend multiple instruments and multiple forms of validity to be used before we draw a conclusion. And when I do psychological assessment, I typically will use multiple instruments that are objective and multiple instruments that are projective tests. And then for me to feel like I see some aspect of personality standing out, I want there to be at least two, if not three, of these psychological tests revealing that factor, not just one. So when we do item selection, right, this is on the individual items, we definitely want to make sure that each item is clear, is relevant, is simple, right? You should aim that your instrument should be at 3rd to 5th grade reading level if you're going to create an instrument. And that may seem like you've dumbed down your instrument, but that actually is good because the average reading level in the United States is anywhere between 5th to 8th grade reading level. And you don't want people to make mistakes in their responses because they didn't understand what you're asking. So you also want to be able to separate out scores for a person who has high levels of that characteristic, moderate levels of that characteristic, and low levels of that characteristic. So you want to be able to distinguish between relative strength versus weakness in a given characteristic. So we expect that. We also want to make sure that each individual item is linked to the general construct or the general theme of the test, but not overly related. Because if you have a Cronbach's alpha that's like 0.98, 0.99, that's probably too strong of a Cronbach's alpha. And what that might indicate is that you had multiple items that were basically asking the same thing. And that's why you got such a strong correlation. And if you do get that, you want to look at each individual item relative to the other items and get rid of any overly redundant items. Now, the final assessment should reflect a normal distribution, right? So people are, individuals can score very low, individuals can score very high, but the vast majority of individuals are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, and it should approximate a bell curve. We do test individual items relative to the general construct using what's called item response theory. This is just a mathematical procedure that helps you determine what are the best items, what items should be kept in the test, what items should be removed from the test, and so forth. And, you know, we do look for patterns or potential biases. So, for example, let's say males and females respond differently to a given item. That might be real differences across gender, but it also could be a bias in the item. So you want to make sure that the items do not have bias in them. All right. So we also want to pay attention to when people fill out the survey, whether, sorry, my cat is kind of like attacking the feet. You want to make sure that people aren't responding with a response set. Now, there are many different response sets. A response set by definition is responding in a patternistic way rather than what you're truly measuring or characteristic you're truly measuring. So you could have something called yay saying or nay saying. Yay saying would be just agreeing with everything, right? Saying true, true, true all the way down, or strongly agree all the way down. So you might hear that referred to as an acquiescence response set, or naysaying, which is to say no, false, or strongly disagree, all the way down. And if that happens, one of the ways to get rid of the acquiescence response set, or the just saying no, naysaying, you could use what's called reverse coding. And reverse coding is just a fancy way of saying that some items are written in one way, and then some items are intentionally phrased in the opposite way to test whether you're just answering from a response set. So if I had an item on an instrument that says, I like ice cream, I might respond true. But if later on that test, I had an item that says, I hate ice cream, I should write false, right? So it's just reverse coded. So I want to pay attention to that. So you could detect acquiescence response sets if they say true all the way down, even if you had reverse coded items. So the other response set that is common is something called a social desirability response set. And a social desirability response set is where people want to answer in a way that makes them look desirable or viewed positively within society. So most people are going to answer in a way that minimizes negative aspects of who they are. But we can test for social desirability by asking relatively benign flaws and seeing if a person agrees to those flaws or disagrees to those flaws. For example, I sometimes am resentful. If a person says I'm sometimes resentful rather than forgiving, most people are going to say true to that. If a person's being socially desirable, they're going to say false. But I would ask you, who isn't resentful at times, right? So you could detect people are trying to present themselves in an overly favorable light by using, social desirability scales. So we also have lie scales, which are designed to detect whether a person is lying. So these are tripped up when a person responds very inconsistency or in a random way. Now, this random responding could be due to boredom. It could be due to them trying to sabotage the research, which is very uncommon. But it could also be due to them not understanding the question. So if they didn't read very well, they could answer in a way that looks like it's random response pattern, but it's just because they didn't understand. So we also have to pay attention to ethnic biases. In fact, many of the early instruments were biased against ethnic minorities. Many of them were normed on a white middle-class college sample, and were not able to be generalized. So we talk about paying attention to whether questions are more likely to be agreed to by one ethnic group over another. So we have to be very careful with that and make sure that there's no ethnic bias. So we talked about this, I know, in other lessons, but cultural factors such as an Asian American versus an Italian American, they might respond very, very differently on shyness, right? So an Asian American might be more cooperative, might be perceived by Westerners as excessively shy, when that's typically a virtue in other cultures. And flip side is an Italian American who might be more assertive might be viewed as aggressive in Eastern culture. So we have to pay attention to how we're scoring tests, what we're looking for, because we can introduce cultural biases into the tests as well. And then gender biases, be very careful with tests that favor one gender over another. Um, you know, it comes up. For example, I think in IQ, there's a few IQ points in favor of males relative to females, but that doesn't mean males are inherently smarter than females on average. And then females typically would rate higher on being nurturing or cooperative. So if misused, personality tests and IQ tests can be used to target a population. A good example of the IQ testing is with Goddard, right? At Goddard measured IQ with new arrivals at Ellis Island. And sure enough, Northern European individuals tended to score more favorably or better on IQ tests relative to Eastern European, but there were some cultural and linguistic barriers or problems there. All right, so self-report tests, one of the most common self-report tests is the MMPI. Now, self-report tests are just usually questionnaires that might be true, false. They might be strongly agree to strongly disagree, whatever it might be. But there are self-report measures, paper pencil questionnaires. Now, in all fairness, today we have Q Global. Many of these instruments you can take online too. But the most common one is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And the MMPI is a good example where the early test, the initial test, was biased against many ethnic minorities. And it had to be modified in 1989 for the MMPI-2 to get rid of outdated and biased examples. Now, the MMPI has options for true, false, cannot say. And we look at your patterns. We look at your personality patterns. Typically, the MMPI does a good job at identifying common clinical problems, but personality disorders, the MMPI does not do a good job. And I guess I should say there is the MMPI-3 since it's not on a bullet point, which recently came out. The Milan Clinical Multiaxial Inventory does a much better at measuring personality disorders than the MMPI. So things like passive aggressiveness, borderline personality disorder, and so forth. Paranoid personality disorder, the MCMI is going to do a much better job with. We also have the NEO-PI. The NEO-PI is an instrument that's linked to the Big Five, and that is usually just common non-pathological aspects of personality. So it's interesting. Different personality tests do different things. So the MMPI looks for general clinical syndromes. The MCMI is more for personality disorders. The NEO-PI is more for non-pathological aspects of personality, right? And then we have the Personality Research Form, which is linked to Henry Murray's basic needs and motivations. And then we have the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory. Now, it's very important to talk about the Myers-Briggs, and I'm going to say this in lecture 4 as well, that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is pretty good at guiding occupational decision-making, but it wasn't very good at measuring personality as a whole. And we'll talk more about that in another lecture. So these are self-report measures. What are the benefits of self-report measures? Well, they tend to be objective, so everybody gets the same items. Every test is scored the same way. It's not linked to my own biases as an administrator, right? And then obviously because it's true, false, or whatever, it's easy to score. One of the disadvantages or weaknesses of self-report measures is that you can get the data you're looking for, but you lose the depth and richness in personality. It's easier to fake, and they tend to be based on more self-awareness of the respondent. So now I'm going to talk to you about another approach called Q-sort tests, where people are given a list of words related to some characteristic, and it's done as on everything from personality to, shopping habits. You could have put into piles of most characteristic, least characteristic, or somewhat characteristic. Typically, we put you into 3 piles, and then you put the actual cards into one of these 3 piles. And it's a forced normal distribution. By design, you can't put all the items in strongly agree or most characteristic of me. You have to rank order them. And it's done in a real cool way where there's a bunch of options or cards that can be placed in the middle. And as you move towards the extremes, there's a fewer and fewer number of options that you could put down. And this is done, like I said, it's done on so many different things. It could be done on self-concept, self-esteem, family factors, generativity, things like happiness, shopping preferences, and so forth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a video that I want to share with you on Q-sort from a YouTuber, and I believe that this will be a pretty good, it's a short video, but a pretty good idea of how Q-sort is done. So let me pull that video up, and we're going to start it, and I'm going to react to it afterwards.
Hi, Lloyd Reaper here, and the purpose of this video is to give you an orientation to a special activity called a Q-sort. Q-sorts are normally done on paper, and I'll start with a quick demonstration of what that looks like. I will then show a digital version of a Q-sort that is meant to be done in the exact same way. Let's begin. You can think of a Q-sort as a unique type of survey. Q-sorts are all about helping individuals and groups understand what their beliefs or opinions are. In other words, Q-sorts are all about understanding people's subjectivity. Q-sorts can be done on any topic that a group or organization feels is important. Topics can be very serious, such as what you think is the proper role of government in our lives, or what you think are the greatest challenges facing America's schools today. But they can also be on fun topics, such as your favorite foods or music. Let's take a look at what a typical paper-based Q-sort looks like using the topic of grocery shopping preferences. You're given a stack of cards that contains the full range of ways of thinking about the topic. Your task is to sort the cards in some way, such as by agreement or preference. You sort the cards in a very special grid that has as many slots as there are statements. As you can see, there are lots of slots toward the middle, but few at each end. Sorting the cards can be challenging. The choices you make will help reveal what you really think about the topic. It can be hard sorting the cards into the grid right away, so it is strongly recommended that you first do a pre-sort into 3 main groups: those you generally agree with, those you don't, and finally those you just aren't sure about. You should do this pre-sort quickly. Just look at each card and make a quick decision as to which of the 3 piles it belongs. When done with this pre-sort, focus on the cards in the agree group and sort those into the grid. Then sort the cards you agree with less. Finally, sort the remaining cards. For serious topics, it can be a difficult task, but also an interesting and challenging one. Toward the end, you'll probably find yourself swapping positions of statements on the grid, and this is very normal. When done, you write the number of the card on a scoring sheet that you then give to your instructor. That's it. That's what a typical Q-sort looks like. Now, let's take a look at the digital version of this exact same Q-sort. You start by entering the activity's special code that your instructor will give you. You then enter your full name, which will only be shared with the instructor. Then you enter an alias, which can be anything you want. This alias will be made public. The Q sort then appears. Just like in the paper Q sort, it's highly recommended that you first do a pre-sort of each of the statements into one of three groups. And this is done by using the sandbox area at the top of the screen. So you would again just very quickly take a look at each of the different statements and put them into one of three groups: high, neutral, or low. Also notice that you can place the statements in the sandbox in a line going from left to right that can represent your relative priority or preference of those particular statements. As soon as all of the statements are in the sandbox area, you'll see three arrows appear on the right-hand side. If you click on any of those arrows, you'll see that the statements in that particular row come down to the main area and in the order in which they were selected. I recommend, just like in the paper version, you start with the statements in the high group first, and then move on to the low group next, and then finally all of the other statements to bring them into the sorting grid, just like you did with the paper version. And just like the paper version, you can then change your mind. You can bring statements back out and resort them. Also notice there's a magnifying tool and an option to change the text size of the statements, which can be very handy when you have longer statements or sentences.
I think that gives enough of a flavor. What's cool about the video that you saw was that you can do a paper base, which is the way I typically do it. But apparently there are online versions of the same test, but typically you start by putting into three piles: agree, neutral, disagree, most characteristic of me, somewhat characteristic, uncharacteristic of me. And then you go about it that way. But the other thing that was nice about the Q sort video is that you notice how it's almost like an upside down bell curve. You have fewer items at the end, and as you move towards the middle, there are more and more options. And that's the way preference should be. So it forces some sense of a normal distribution. Now, this is just one example of how you could get people's values. There are many other instruments, but as I said, it could be on virtually anything. So what are some advantages of Q sort? Well, it's more involved than a questionnaire, so you keep a person engaged. They're less likely to get bored. You can get rank orders of characteristics or responses in a better way than some of the self-report items. And you could actually use the Q sort not just about oneself, but we could have other people use the same cards to describe you, or for you to describe other people, such as one's wife or children. Now, in terms of disadvantages, as I said, every measure has some disadvantage. It might be limited in its richness. It's easy to fake at times, and it requires you to have some self-knowledge or self-awareness. So another approach to having personality is to have other people rate you. So rating or judgments of others. And this could be a romantic partner, this could be a friend, it could be a teacher, it could be a parent. For example, one of the measures that we give is a measure of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the Vanderbilt is designed to be given to a parent, teacher, and a self-rating. And what we find is that sometimes the scores are pretty consistent, whereas many times the scores are very different, in which what I have seen is that teachers tend to exaggerate the negative symptoms of the individual. Parents tend to underrepresent the negative features of a child. And then, people's self-rating tends to be somewhere in the middle. But this does give, a different view, how you view yourself versus how other people view you. And that can increase the validity of the report. Now, obviously, you have to compare and contrast them. You have to interpret them as a psychologist. But as I noted, personal biases can creep in, right? So teachers, if they're frustrated with the student, they might over exaggerate the negativity. Parents might say, not my child, and so forth. So you have to be very, very careful about biases there. Now, advantage is that it reveals basic traits. It can be used for children, animals, and so forth. Now, biology is another way of measuring personality, and early attempts at measuring personality through biology were very poor. One of the common ones by Franz Gall was something called phrenology, where he studied the bumps of your head and inferred personality characteristics. Now, interesting to note, your shape or morphology of your head doesn't match your skull even. And then your skull doesn't match the convolutions of your brain. So ultimately, there are a lot of problems with phrenology. It didn't really do a lot of justice to personality. And the labels of personality were pretty poor too. They actually weren't, the parts of the brain were not linked to actually what they functioned with. So if you look at early phrenology maps, they're so wrong. But nevertheless, the one advantage was that it did highlight the point that different parts of the brain do different functions. And I guess that's the one silver lining, because neuroscience has done a better job at mapping what different parts of the brain do. Now, more reliable measures of biological assessment have emerged. So reaction time is a nice measure. Skin conductance for sweating is a nice measure. EEG, measuring brain functioning. Firing of the neurons in the brain is a nice measure. PET scans or fMRIs are good measures. So you could see activity of the brain or different parts of the brain based on doing a task. And it could show relative, I guess, weaknesses in functioning or exaggerated function in different parts of the brain relative to typical people. And fMRI are, again, instead of using radioactive glucose, here you're using hemoglobin, right? fMRIs. And then we also have post-mortem analyses studying the brain after death. A lot of our knowledge about issues like CTE, right? Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, basically repeated hits to the head, and how it affected people, increased depression, suicide, and so forth. We know from postmortem studies with football players and wrestlers and so forth. But we could also measure hormone levels, neurotransmitter levels, and how they're linked to personality as well. On a genetic or chromosomal level, we could look at your 46 chromosomes, or your typical 46 chromosomes. Now, it's important to say the difference between a gene and a chromosome. A chromosome is a larger strand of DNA, whereas genes are smaller pieces of DNA along a chromosome. And then you could have genetic abnormalities or chromosomal abnormalities that might result in a personality disorder or a cognitive disorder. For example, trisomy 21, the root tri means three, some, three chromosomes on the 21st pairing. That's also known as Down syndrome, right? So we have Down syndrome, which it affects both cognition and personality. That's a common example of a chromosomal abnormality. But one of the biggest criticisms of studying genes and chromosomes and personality is that very rarely is a singular gene or chromosome linked to personality functioning. There's a very complex relationship. So we have to be very careful about over-interpreting genes and chromosome, right? So there's something called polygenetic inheritance, multiple genes impacting personality functioning. So we also have behavioral observations, and this is something we've done early, even pre-psychology or psychological science. So people like Francis Galton used observational techniques to study individual differences. So now instead of asking people to report for themselves, you're observing and you're scoring their functioning. But you can do this in an experience sampling technique where you have a text message go out to a person or a beeper vibrate and they have to write what they're doing. And then you code patterns of behavior through experience sampling. So what are some of the advantages of behavioral measures? Well, you capture exactly what the person is doing in real time. So that makes it less likely for you to lie. However, when you're observing a person, that's just a snapshot in time. They might behave differently in another period of time, and they might behave differently because they know you're watching them, right? So you have to be very careful in your interpretation and linking it to personality. Interviews are another source of understanding personality. So we have structured interviews, we have semi-structured interviews, we have unstructured interviews. Now we're asking you questions with follow-up questions. A structured interview tends to be everybody gets the same questions. An unstructured interview is absolutely personalized to the individual. And a semi-structured interview, which is what most clinicians use in terms of a psychotherapeutic interview, is where we have general areas we're going to hit on, and we ask everybody about those aspects of life. But when the person responds, we do a deeper dive based on their answers. So it's individualized based on their answers to some extent. So we talked about structured, unstructured interviews already. So the advantages of interviews is that you get to do follow-up, you get to probe deeper, it's flexible. The disadvantage is that perhaps the way you ask the question might have altered the response, or perhaps the person may have answered in an uncharacteristic way because of who you are. It also can be expensive and time consuming. Now, nonverbal or expressive behavior also is part of the picture. In fact, nonverbal communication is about 50% of the narrative. So paying attention to your posture, how you speak, not just what you're saying, but how you speak, your relative walking or moving, all of these things, your eye contact, all of these things communicate something to us. So we will listen to your rate of speech. Well, people tend to speak faster when they're anxious or when they're manic. The voice quality, right? So articulation, we pay attention to as well. Gaze, whether you make eye contact or you don't make eye contact, that's going to tell us something about self-esteem, security, and obviously there are cultural variations in gaze too, so you want to pay attention to that too. Posture and gestures also. All right. So now let's move to projective tests. So we talked about all these different types of tests you can use: objective tests, interviews, self-report, Q-sort, all of these things. Now we get to the projective tests. Projective tests are subjective in nature, where we give you a prompt and you can run with that prompt any way you want. The goal is it's intentionally ambiguous so that you can project, hence the word projective test, your own identity or personality onto the test. So Hermann Rorschach is famous for the ink blot test, where he'd show you 10 cards, some were black and white. some were grayscale, some were color, and he asked you to tell him what you saw in the card. And what you saw, he would write it down. And then after going through the 10 cards, he would go back and then say, okay, now where did you see it? And by doing this, he would understand, I want to understand how you see the world and help me see it the way you see it. He would understand things like movement, shading, the use of color, pair images, and so forth. And there was a coding system called Exner's coding system, which actually helped us objectively score the Rorschach. But the Rorschach is, you could say you see anything you want. So you could say, I see a jet in the middle. I see two bears high-fiving, right? Anything you want. I see eyes at the top. And people see multiple things in a given image, right? So you could say whatever you want. Now, we also have thematic apperception tests. A TAT is where, and this is the top picture, where we give you a card and you are asked to tell a story about the card. And you're meant to have a story that has a beginning, middle, end, thoughts, and feelings. And the real benefit of the TAT is that it allows us to see how you resolve conflict. And there are 30 cards, but you typically have about 10 cards you give. And then you look for patterns of emotions and conflict resolution and so forth. And then you have drawing tests. So drawing a person could be a projection as to how you see yourself. There's a house tree person test. There are many drawing tests. But when we look at it, these instruments, you could question whether you have reliability and validity. That's why you need to be trained for them. Now, other things we collect data on are demographics, things like age, gender, ethnicity, place of birth, religion, family size, because even though these aren't psychological in nature, it gives me a profile of who you are, and potentially that, you know, who you are and how you were raised, where you were raised, could influence some personality factors. All right. Now, there is no singular best way to study personality. We usually use a combination. As I said, when I do psychological assessment, personality assessment, I use both objective and projective tests. Now, how not to test personality: astrology, looking at the stars, and horoscopes, phrenology, which we talked about, palm reading, numerology, and graphology. None of these have demonstrated sufficient reliability and consistency and validity. Now, other research methods are case studies. Case studies are in-depth analysis of the individual. Now, it's important to understand you might get deep understanding of the individual, but you can't generalize out from that person. Correlation, we talked about the relationship between variables in the previous lesson, and then experiments where we manipulate a factor to see a given outcome if we wanted to determine cause and effect. Now, sometimes we're looking for group-based differences, but we can't manipulate it. So I can't manipulate things like age or gender, ethnicity, but I still could put you into groups based on these factors and then study personality as a function of these factors and get meaningful outcomes. So we study, I hope that this was a very fast crash course on personality and how it's measured, factors like reliability, validity, and how scientists use it. But next lesson, we're actually going to meet Sigmund Freud, and we're going to talk all about Freud's psychoanalysis, and we're going to move forward. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll talk about Freud next time. Take care, everybody.